Today, we are proud to partner with our colleagues of the Diverse Corporate Directors Coalition in a conversation on the role of the board in addressing the issues of the day. Just a little bit of background about this dynamic coalition. It was formed 3 years ago. 3 years ago at the LCDA's 2017 convening, we brought together the leaders of the Black Corporate Directors Conference, Ascend Pinnacle, Women Corporate Directors, Quorum, the LGBTQ plus directors, and following the 2017 meeting, the group decided that we have way too much work to do. Women corporate directors are a part of this. I want to thank Susan Keating, who's also on the call today. And we have collaborated since. KPMG and Target Corporation have been supporters from the very beginning. And I'd like to thank KPMG and Target for supporting today's session. The vision of the DCDC is a corporate America where boardrooms leverage the strength of America's diversity as a competitive advantage. The combined membership of our organizations demonstrate that there is ample supply of diverse, experienced directors and board qualified executives that are here. All of our organizations bring together not only corporate directors, but we're investing in growing the supply by identifying board qualified executives. Today, we sent and circulated to you all a working plan. It's a call to action by the DCDC. The panel will be discussing the elements of this call to action. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Charlotte. Charlotte is the executive director of the 30% Coalition. And as background, over the last 3 to 5 years, it has been the push by institutional investors and pension funds, treasurers, that have created a great demand to diversify boards and add women. This has been long overdue. And we're pleased to see that today, investors are calling for the inclusion of race and ethnicity in the boardroom. So here to tell us about the pivot, again, is Charlotte Laurent Odomain, Executive Director of the 30% Coalition. I am proud to serve as a board member of this organization, which has been a pioneer in driving demand. Charlotte?
Thanks, Esther, and thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm kicking this off with just some brief comments about the 30% Coalition. As Esther said, we are a national organization with a really big reach today. In addition to institutional investors, we also have public companies. We have a large group of private equity firms, state treasurers, and most of the women's organizations in the U.S. who are all coming together to work on increasing the number of women and people of color in the boardroom. Our investors do have a very powerful reach, and we have been extremely successful over the last several years. Very early on, we created co-founded the coalition in 2011. The investors started an Adopt a Company campaign. So every year we reach out to those companies that have no women or recently one woman on their board, encouraging them to consider adding one or another one. And in addition to that, to consider making a public commitment to diversity inclusive of race, gender, and ethnicity, and adopting the Rooney Rule, which, as you know, includes women and people of color in the candidate pool. I think that, we have been successful in a world that still needs a lot of change, but to date, we have 400 companies that have appointed a woman to the board for the first time. Our investors represent 6 trillion in assets under management, and that continues to grow as we have become a unique organization here in the U.S. The differentiator of the 30% coalition is, as Esther said, is that we're working on the demand side. And by that I mean collaboratively influencing companies to open their boardroom doors. So those 400 companies, I'm not quite sure where the women came from, which, you know, I think in today's conversation starts to become a concern and a topic that we want to address. Fast forward to today, you know, we've been in, and the topic of this session is the issue of racial diversity and the responsibility of corporate boards in terms of including that in their boardroom and in their companies, actually. This year has been extremely painful and challenging for all of us. And my friend Susan Angeli made a comment that has stuck with me for several months now, is that we can make a contribution to righting some of the terrible wrongs that exist today by doing what we do best. And for the 30% coalition, that is the corporate boardroom. Our vision since the very beginning has been that the corporate boardroom reflect the ethnic, gender, and racial diversity of the U.S. workforce. We measure women. We measured them in 2011, and we measure them today. Unfortunately, we do not measure anything else. So our outreach every year is, dear company, we realize that you have no women on your board. I cannot say today, we realize that you do not have any racial diversity. So I think that, you know, the voices are growing stronger, but I do think we have to be thoughtful and meaningful about how we approach this. The coalition, the 30% coalition's call to action this year, in addition to seriously considering racial, ethnic, and gender diversity in the boardroom, is to consider disclosure. I think that until we reach a point where companies disclose the composition of their board, then we're not going to make any progress. Because if we don't know what we're counting, if we don't know where we are today, I don't think we can move forward. So we're working on this. I applaud all of you for being in this session, the participants and the panelists, and look forward to working with all of you as we working together on this important initiative going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlotte. And the board did act to change the bylaws or update the bylaws and the mission of the organization to help advance and grow demand for women and people of color.
We did. And sorry, I did not mention that, but a month ago, we did very seriously consider the situation, and we have changed our mission statement today, which states that the 30% coalition advocates for corporate board diversity, including women and people of color. What does that mean? That means for the first time, we have opened the boardroom doors, our advocacy to men of color. I think it's very important. I do think it is the first page in a very long chapter. We have to measure it before we can push further on this. But for us, it was a statement of solidarity and recognizing that the landscape has changed. We need to support, and we need to do this for the business case of board diversity, which we're all working for. Thanks for reminding me, Esther.
No, sure. Thank you. And you'll hear more about the DCDC's call to action, which overlaps with some of what you said. So let's get started. So first, I will review a few rules to guide today's meeting. So most of us are familiar with the Zoom meeting platform. So except for the panel, we ask you to mute your microphone until we are in the audience Q&A segment of the program. And during the audience Q&A, please use your chat feature. You know, that's the button at the bottom center of the Zoom screen, to either post your question to be read by the moderator, or to alert the host that you want to share and state your question, at which time the moderator will ask you to unmute your phone to ask your question. So also, let's be mindful that the views and remarks shared by the speakers today are their own or that of their organizations, but they do not reflect the views of their company affiliations. We are also following a relaxed Chatham House rules. That basically means that panelists and participants are free to share and use information from today's discussion. But let's refrain from quoting anybody unless LCDA or the individual approves a quote. That way we can maximize everyone's voices and be respectful. So now I would like to turn it over to mi hermana, Susan Angeli. Susan, to get us started and introduce the panel. Susan is a senior advisor in board governance at KPMG's Board Leadership Center. She serves on the board of our foundation, the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, and chairs our programs committee. And today, she was named as one of NACD's 100, NACD Directorship 100 in the corporate governance professionals and industry sector. So a hearty congratulations to Susan. I turn it over to you and the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Okay, so Esther had asked me to run through some of the statistics just to level set and then introduce the moderator and the rest of the panel. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes and let's frame it up as we know the glass is half empty. We also know that collectively among all of these organizations, there's more than enough water to fill the glass full and even overflow it. I want to echo what Charlotte said about disclosure, because the statistics that I'm about to cite to you are all based on people's knowledge that someone identifies as a particular group, not based on proxy disclosures for the most part. Once they're based on proxy disclosures, we can get a lot more robustness in the metrics and in the tracking. So to start, according to a report by Russell Reynolds using data from the Alliance for Board Diversity, representation on Fortune 500 boards for people of color was at 16% based on 2018 proxies, having moved little from the 12% measured in 2010. And the breakdown there was 9% Black, 4% Latino, and 4% Asian. If you look at the larger group of the Fortune 1000, the numbers are even lower. We don't have all of them, but our own reports in conjunction with LCDA and also with Ascend measured just 2.7% for Latinos and just over 3% for Asians. Openly LGBT corporate directors are so rare that you can pretty much count using just fingers and toes and a little bit extra. Matt Fust and his friends at Quorum actually counted them, and it's 24 corporate directors, which comes to 0.4% of public company boards. And if you compare that to the estimated 4.5% of the US population who identifies LGBT, there's certainly a lot of room to grow. As we know, women do paint a rosier picture, and a lot of progress has been made. Currently, women make up over 25% of Fortune 500 board seats, and which is exponential growth given that the figure was 16% in 2010. And a new milestone was reached recently when it was announced that every single Fortune 500 board now has at least one woman. Now, I can even find gloom here though, because yes, 25% is a big number, but it's only half of the roughly 50% of the population that are women. Also, only 60 companies out of the entire Russell 3000 group have boards that are at least 50% women. Furthermore, the percentage of women who are women of color is dramatically underrepresented at only 4.6% out of the 22% of women on boards of the Fortune 500 as identified in the 2018 public company boards. In 2019, there were some progress made, as we know, in California with women joining boards. 511 of the women joined public company boards. The profile here in terms of women of color is really quite stark. So out of those 511, 77% are white, which is an over-representation in a state where the population is 36.5% white. By contrast, 11.5% are Asian, 5.3% are Black, and 3.3% are Latina. And I'm going to say that again, 3.3% are Latina in California, a state where there's an overall Latino population of 39.4%. Again, lots of room to fill up that glass. So having said that, we continue to move toward the light at the end of the tunnel, and we're going to talk about how to increase the heat of the fire in order to accelerate this train that we're all trying to push forward. Each panelist today is a strong advocate for diversity and also a distinguished board leader with experience, accolades, and awards that would take the entire session to describe. So I'm going to summarize them very briefly. I'll start with our moderator and then introduce the other panelists in alphabetical order. The moderator, who is with us on the phone due to some connection problems, is the Honorable Ken Salazar, who is an LCDA member, partner and co-chair of the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources practice of WilmerHale, former U.S. Secretary of the Interior and Senator from Colorado, and a director on the Mayo Clinic and Target Corporation boards.
Susan, we have the secretary on the Zoom screen now.
Oh, fantastic. Great. Our next speaker is Evelyn Dion. Evelyn is co-chair for Board Next, which is the pipeline initiative of the Women Corporate Directors Foundation. Evelyn is also a director of Inochian Biosciences, Inc., GHD, and Summer Infant. And Evelyn is not only a WCD member, but also an LCDA member. Matt Fust, Senior Advisor to Out Leadership's Quorum Initiative. Matt is an advisor to life sciences companies and on the board of Ultragenyx, Atara Biotherapeutics, Crinetics Pharmaceuticals, and Blackthorns Therapeutics. John Rogers is really a legendary voice lifting up Black business leaders. He's a founder of the Black Corporate Directors Conference, Chairman, CEO, and Chief Investment Officer of Ariel Investments, a director on the board of Exelon, McDonald's, and Nike. And last but not least, Janet Wong, the National Executive Advisor for Ascend Pinnacle, and a director on the boards of Enviva Partners and Allegiance Bankshares. So over to you, Secretary Salazar.
Thank you very, very much, Susan, and to Charlotte and to Esther for putting all this together, and for the speakers and all of you who are here. So let's start out with a little round of applause for everybody, because this is a great cause, and so many of you I have worked with before. John Rogers, I remember your mentorship of so many fronts, all of you, Esther from way back in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, your great work there. So obviously this is a meeting which we hope has a lot of energy to it, and we hope that the outcome of the meeting is really to build on the great work that has already been going on with the organizations, knowing that we have so much more to go. So looking forward to the conversation here, and looking forward to the collective intelligence and power, which is represented by all of you who are joining this conference this afternoon. So let me start out by first saying that we can really deal with this issue that we're dealing with now in terms of corporate inclusivity, corporate board inclusivity, or corporate C-suite inclusivity, without really understanding all the rest of the world that is unfolding in front of us in terms of the major crisis that we're facing. We deal with it every day. You're dealing with it. I look at it from the point of view of the pandemic. We are right in the middle of it. There's more waves to come. Probably won't be at a point where we're in a post-pandemic normalcy till sometime into 2021. Number two, the jobs issue that comes from that. We think today there's over 31 million people who are unemployed collecting unemployment benefits. That is almost 3 times as many as the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis. I remember being in the White House often with President Obama and walking with him and asking him what worried him the most back in 2009. And he would say, it's the 11 million people who don't have a job and who are worried about whether they're going to be able to make their mortgage payment. We have some 30 million people in the United States of America today. So we can't lose the stark reality of that in our own minds. And third, notwithstanding those crises, another one that came on board, which has been with us for a very long time, is the whole issue of racial justice. George Floyd and what happened in a place where Laisha Ward and I spent a lot of time, Minneapolis, St. Paul, raised the consciousness of America that we have made progress, but I think reminds us as well that Dr. King's view of the world is that the arc of the moral universe is long. It's very long, and we bent it some, you're bending it some, but we sure have a hell of a long ways to go. And it's going to take a collective heart of the United States to really get us to a different plane. That the time of the Civil War amendments back in the 1860s after the Civil War, Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, the progress that we've made, we are still on that road, and there is still so much more to be done. So in that context, what Esther and Susan and Laisha and the speakers here did in the pre-call we had is we said we had to have a call to action. And so that call to action has really been put to them now in draft form, but something that hopefully is more than just us having a conference and saying we got to do more. It's really a set of very specific recommendations on what we ought to do. One question that I think everybody ought to be thinking about, is it enough? Should we do more? Should we propose legislative measures in each of the states? Should we do something at the national level? Or how about with some of the regulatory bodies like the SEC? We ought to be thinking about that. But the reality of it is that, as Susan described, there is so much more to go. So with that said, I am honored to be the moderator this afternoon from the glorious Rocky Mountain High of Denver, Colorado, and to have this wonderful group of speakers with us. And so I'm going to ask each of the speakers, we'll start with John Rogers, that will ask you to say something about your organization, but also make a comment about why you think this agenda is so important and what it is that we ought to do. So we'll use that as an opening statement. So first, John Rogers out of Chicago, Illinois.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here today. It's great to bring the gang back together. I do remember when we got started with this conversation, so we've got to continue it where all of us can work together on behalf of our various constituencies. This issue is really, really important today. More important than ever, I think, as you've touched on with the George Floyd situation. And one of the things I start to say why it's so important is the data is just crystal clear. You know, the wealth gap in this country has gotten larger and larger between minority communities and the majority community. And we in boardrooms can help impact that wealth gap. And I use the data often using African Americans, but it's very similar for the Latino community, that between 1992 and 2016, College-educated African Americans saw their wealth decline 10%, while college-educated whites saw their wealth increase 96%. This data comes from the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. So of roughly 25 years, up 96% for whites, down 10% for blacks. The dean of Yale's Business School, Kerwin Charles, has data that shows that African American families today, relative to white Americans, are worse off today than our grandparents were. It shows you that this wealth gap and opportunity gap, economic gap, has just gotten larger and larger and larger. And if you think about it, those of us that are in corporate boardrooms not only influence our boards, but often are impacting local political leaders, community groups, churches, and other organizations. So there's no better group of leaders to interact with when it comes to business as minority directors. That's why it's so important. The inspiration for our conference really comes from a longtime civil rights leader, Reverend Leon Sullivan. He was on the General Motors board. And when there was a big issue back then about South Africa, he created the Sullivan Principles. He left a legacy there to make sure that General Motors was doing the right thing when it came to the South African issue and the horrendous segregation and unfairness that was alive and well in South Africa at the time. And I started to think about it. Too often, those of us that are directors in boardrooms don't leave a legacy. We really don't make a difference. Too often, we're happy to be in the boardroom, accept our checks, and make the broader community comfortable. We need to, in the spirit of what John Lewis often talked about, when we see things that are not right, when we see things that are not fair, we have a moral responsibility to stand up and fight the way Leon Sullivan did. So at our conference that we started with Charles Tribbett from Russell Reynolds, from the very beginning, we only had 35 directors, and now we get over 200 directors. We always had a conscience of the conference, someone to remind us of the responsibilities that we have in the boardroom. And we've had people like John Lewis, of course. He was a real get for us. But we had Harry Belafonte. We've had Reverend Jackson. We've had former Ambassador Andy Young. We've had Representative Clybourne, Valerie Jarrett, and President Obama has actually come. And all of us are there every Friday night at the conference to remind us that if we're in that boardroom, again, we have a responsibility to fight for economic justice when we're in that boardroom. And that's something that's a distinct difference of our conference than maybe what people think it's all about. We want more of us on the board, but we want the right kind of directors who are going to make a difference and leave a legacy once they're in the boardroom.
Thank you very much, John. Those are wonderful, inspirational words and a charge to all of us. Let's next hear from Evelyn DeAnne. So Evelyn, I'm not sure I have the right order, so I'm just going to go with the order that I have here. So Evelyn, you're up next.
Hi, thank you, Secretary Zalazar. It's wonderful to be part of this very important conversation. And Susan, thank you for the intro. On a personal note that I wanted to add, because there's so many of you that I don't know, my parents are both from Puerto Rico. And I was raised and grew up in the South Bronx, and so I'm coming at you today from beautiful Miami Beach, but my heart is always with New York. I'm delighted to be amongst this group of just incredible speakers, and most important, that all of you that showed up. I mean, just by showing up, you're showing intent on being a part of this very important conversation. And today I am honored to be representing women corporate directors. Big shout out to my CEO, Susan Keating, who's on the call with us, and so many WCD members that are joining us this afternoon, supporting this really important call to action. WCD has been focused on gender diversity for almost 20 years now. When our founder, Susan Stoutberg, had this vision of creating a network of peers in order to be able to increase their leadership, in order to be able to have them be impactful in their communities. And this was done at a time where there were very few women on board. So a very tough task back then. Currently, WCD has over 2,500 members around the globe, 76 chapters. Our members collectively serve on 8,500 public and private company boards. So we are definitely a group of influence. And so while we hear the trends and the fact that the presence of women has grown in the boardroom, as a result of significant undertakings for many years by many organizations like WCD. And also remember, we had some legislative support in the state of California. The fact remains that the ethnicity, as Susan mentioned, of that women in the boardroom remains to be a challenge. And Susan shared some very interesting statistics with you regarding a recent review done in California. And I think at this point, when I think about, why is the time now? I'm actually going to steal a concept from a beloved peer who spoke about this very subject at a WCT webinar, Ann Ward, CEO of Curio Brands Director, and she looked at it from the perspective of leadership. What is happening right now with leadership, and what type of leaders are we looking that are coming out from this pandemic? I mean, it's definitely a challenging time to lead a company. So what kind of leaders are we seeing right now, and what's changing? And she came up with a very interesting term. She called it a leader of comfort is now becoming a leader of consequence. And what does that mean? A leader of comfort is someone that's been going about accustomed to doing the same things that they do every day, looking at best practices, making sure that their organizations are the best that they can possibly be, operating in a fashion where they believe that everything is well, operating in a fashion where they believe that mostly everybody is happy. Now, a leader of consequence is someone that's much more intentional, is somebody that has more clarity around purpose. And it's a leader that is moving right now into very unfamiliar grounds, in many cases uncomfortable. These are uncomfortable conversations that we're having. They're very tough. And so I think that we're seeing a lot of these leaders stepping up to the plate and actually admitting that, yes, our company is pumping money into DE&I, where we've got employee resource groups like you wouldn't believe. We're putting money into all of these wonderful foundations, but they're admitting that they have just not been paying enough attention to this issue. And so we're seeing some of that change in leadership. And I think that, along with so many other things that we're seeing, is causing this to be a now event. The time is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Great comments. Absolutely spot on. Let's go over to Matt. Matt Faust, tell us about your world, how you see it, and what you think about our diversity initiative here.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here representing Quorum, which represents current and aspiring LGBTQ+ corporate board members. And as Susan mentioned in introduction, is a program and organization called Out Leadership. I was struck in listening to the comments that I think the LGBT community of executives has faced some challenges that will be familiar to other members of the coalition. When the organization was founded a decade ago, it was initially organized and identified around building a set of LGBT board members and executives who were board ready, in the belief that it was a pipeline problem, as we often hear. And it turned out, unsurprisingly, that it was in fact a demand problem for diversity on corporate boards. And I think that story will be familiar to a lot of underrepresented groups in the boardroom. Quorum today is really focused on three primary efforts. We do continue to identify, train, and advocate for LGBT executives, and have built what we think is the largest database of about 1,000 LGBT executives who serve on boards or who are aspiring directors. But maybe more important for today's call, also focused on encouraging companies to adopt more board diversity policies and practices that are inclusive of underrepresented communities, and also encouraging institutional investors to engage with their portfolio companies around LGBT diversity. I particularly picked up on the note that Charlotte made in her opening comments that gathering data about board demographics is especially challenging. That's true even for public companies, and especially so for the large number of venture-backed, private equity-backed, or private company boards where those data aren't available. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation today and going forward about how to change some of that.
Thank you very much, Matt. Great comments, and I love the concept of pipeline, right? Because that's what they always say. They say, well, we look, but we can't find them. But it's not a pipeline issue, right? It's a demand issue. Are we going to go out and get people from a diverse background to be part of this board? So let's turn it over to Janet. Janet
Thank
Wong.
you.
Great to see
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and LCDA as well for inviting me to participate this afternoon in this unique call to action. I think this is the third LCDA convening that I've attended, so I see a lot of familiar faces out there today. So thanks for being here. Susan did a kind introduction for me and my background. I'm a retired partner with KPMG, so during the course of my career, I've spent a lot of time in voluntary service. So as Susan mentioned today, I sit on 2 public company boards, and I still continue my voluntary service as well, which includes Ascend, where I'm the lead executive advisor for Ascend Pinnacle. Ascend Pinnacle is part of the broader organization known as Ascend, the largest nonprofit career lifecycle Pan-Asian organization for business professionals in the US as well as in Canada. It was established in 2005, and Ascend's reach includes more than 60,000 senior executives, professionals, graduate and undergraduate students involved in more than 50 chapters in the US as well as Canada. Ascend Pinnacle was launched by Ascend to focus on Asian American corporate board directors in the US. And it includes a platform of 3 major areas. The first one is to network, leverage, and support current Asian Americans that sit on corporate boards. And Pinnacle achieves this through a number of events, including hosting its summit, which is an annual event for Asian Americans that are experienced corporate directors as well as senior executives. And it's very similar to the LCDA convening. And we also hold regional roundtable events throughout the year that are currently all virtual because of the pandemic. And then second, we develop aspiring candidates for future board service through our Aspiring Directors Institute, or the ADI, and that's a year-round cohort program, and we're about to kick off our 4th class for that program. And then third, we provide thought leadership, including issues related to corporate boards and what corporate board directors have on top of their minds. For example, through KPMG, one of our founding sponsors, we will release our first study later this month on Asian representation in the boardrooms of Fortune 1000 companies. Ascend Pinnacle continues to build relationships with organizations supporting our similar goal of board diversity. These organizations include the 30% Coalition, so I'm glad that Charlotte is here today, NACD, and I see Rochelle out in the audience, and of course the DCDC and its member organizations. Our relationship with the DCDC has been invaluable, especially in sharing best practices, working together for advocacy, and creating in supply and demand. Where Pinnacle, we use the pull from our experienced board directors and the push from our aspiring directors to create momentum for change in the boardroom. And I think today, in echoing Mr. Secretary's comments, as well as my other panelists, the time is now for change. Certainly events that happened recently, and probably most prevalent with George Floyd, there's been a lot of discussions from companies, and I'm proud to say, and I know just completing quarterly board meetings on my board, that we were certainly having active discussions about what we were going to do as a company to try to create better balance in racial justice and inequities. So again, I appreciate being here today and look forward to continued discussion on this panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Janet. I'm mindful here of the time, so let me just want to ask you each to comment in a couple minutes on the question, and we'll just take it in reverse order on which you presented, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So, John, I hear your words, which are incredible. Conscience in the boardroom, legacy in the boardroom. Evelyn, powerful words. Leaders of comfort versus leaders of consequence. Matt, pipeline issue is not really the issue, it's a demand issue. Do we want you? Real important things. Janet, all the 3-point program that you have going on in Ascent and the coalition that you talked about. And themes that we were talking about relative to this conference was, the landscape of board diversity. We've covered that in some of the opening comments and some of the other statistics. Disclosure, data collection, we've covered some of that. I think I hear a sense from all the speakers so far that the time is now. We got to do something about this. Supply and talent pipeline goes to Matt's comments. The business case for diversity, I know all of you can make that as well. But my question to you is, having been in this world and having reflected on it, having been in the boardrooms, having done what you've done with organizations, this action plan that was put together by a few of you, tell us what your sense of it is. What do you think is the most important part of that action plan? Are there other things that we ought to be thinking about an action plan that will get us to the point where we make a difference, where we are leaders of consequence, where we are the conscience? What more should we do? So comment on this action plan that is being circulated widely. What should we do about it to actuate it? So let's start with Janet.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I hope everyone received the materials before the meeting. It was emailed to you. It's, I think, a very succinct action plan. Of course, we will appreciate any comments that you have, but I think we clearly lay out a call to action for companies. And I think all of us participating are stakeholders with our companies. Either we are sitting on corporate boards, we are executives within our boards, we are investors, we are somehow stakeholders where we can call to action on the companies that we're involved with to look at first what their board composition is. I think that's important first. And if your board is 100% male or 100% white, then it may be time to look at what can you do. And so what we've laid out in our call to action are some specific steps and sort of a roadmap of some of the things, including in the area of practice. We want companies to look at having a board that's at least 50% represented of America's strength of diversity. So we're not saying a quota, but looking at what is the makeup of your company's board. And we have some specific actions in looking at that. I don't know if Mr. Secretary can go into those.
So let me just ask you the question. If so we have this action plan, 3-4 pages long. It'd be good for everybody to comment on it. If there's one thing that you think we collectively can do to realize the vision that I think we all share, what would it be?
Well, I think the best thing we can do, obviously, is read it, understand it, and then take action and have some accountability. One of the things that we want to do as the coalition is to follow up. So we don't want to just have this meeting and say, here's this call to action, this plan. We want to have meaningful change and movement. And I think each of the panelists and Mr. Secretary, gave the reasons as why the time is right now to do that. And I think
So I think what you're saying is making sure that it's not just a plan that goes on a shelf, has to be finalized, but then there has to be follow-up, and this is a good group to do it. So
yes.
Let's go over to, is that right, Janet? Did I get it right there?
Yes, that
Okay.
Actions are what's needed now, not just the words on the paper.
The doers of deeds. Okay, Matt, what do you think?
I think that's a tremendous segue, and if I might, I will steal your question about one thing to work on. As a career CFO, I've carried the mantra that what gets measured gets managed. And as we've heard already, I think in the course of this call several times, simply finding the data about the demographic composition of America's boardrooms has been a challenge. That's certainly true for private companies, but even for publicly traded companies. And so I would really sound the note of one of the items in the call to action today to encourage companies to determine, disclose, and report on the demographics of their boards, not to bury that, not to force us to count pronouns to figure out how many male or female directors or look at last names to try and guess at race and ethnicity, but instead to step forward as companies and be candid about the current demographics of their board as well as their goals. I think that would be really valuable, and that's an action that every director currently on the phone can take when he or she is at their next board meeting.
So Matt, let me follow up a question on that. So yes, if we are leaders of conscience, we certainly ought to be doing that in terms of the companies where we're a part of. But is there something beyond that we ought to be doing? Should we be encouraging the federal regulators to do disclosure? Should we be following the legislation in California? You know, I know there's a number of attorneys general who are good friends of mine, state attorneys general, who are very interested in this issue. Is there a role for government to achieve what you just talked about in terms of disclosure so that then we can measure?
Absolutely. I think government and other stakeholders. So this is at heart actions that can be taken by boards, but an issue that can be taken up by multiple stakeholders. We know, for example, that for publicly traded companies in the US, the requirement now to disclose in annual proxy filings whether they consider diversity has forced every company to go on record and at least answer that question as to whether and how they think about diversity in identifying board candidates. Similarly, a number of state legislatures have now passed requirements that companies disclose the compositions of their boards, whether that's the insurance commissioner here in California or recent legislation in New York and Illinois. So definitely, I think, a role for governments. We heard in Janet's comment, I think, about shareholder advocacy organizations like ISS and Glass Lewis reaching out on this topic. And frankly, employee groups as well can have significant voice inside their companies. Plenty of room, I think, for folks to take up this action with us.
Thank you very much, Matt. Evelyn, turning to you.
Well, I'm a huge proponent of accountability. And so I'm gonna share a couple of thoughts around accountability and what we as directors can do. It's where the rubber meets the road, and as one of my peers called it, the angel of accountability. There's expected pressures. We're already feeling it from all constituencies: employees, customers, shareholders, investors. It's coming at us from all angles. So how do we as directors lead the charge? You know, how do we need to hold ourselves first and foremost accountable? You know, we can talk a lot about policy and practices, but you know, those two combined will only be effective if boards and individual directors can hold themselves accountable to the results of those actions. And so how do we build accountability into this plan? I mean, what are like some of the real things that can be done? And I think first and foremost, as directors, I think first you have to be prepared to really be able to ask some of these tough questions. You have to call for metrics. You know, metrics are important. You've got to have the measurements in place. You have to ask for reporting. Make it part of your standard board agenda. However, regularly we're meeting now. I know most of us are meeting almost monthly now versus quarterly. It must become part of our agenda. And expect results. I mean, you know, we spend a lot of time focused on the top line, the bottom line, EBITDA, EBIT, we need to focus on this as well. These metrics are just as important and need to be part of our standard agenda. We mentioned pipeline initiatives. It's come up a couple of times. There's nothing more important than understanding and asking questions around what does the pipeline in my company look like? And if we want to have a certain amount of racial diversity at certain levels, forget about the C-suite. At the VP level, at the director level, what are we doing with our pipeline, and how are we educating, mentoring, doing the things that we need to do to move those people up the career path? I'm a numbers person and data.
So let me just keep us here on track. From your point of view, we within our own corporations have that special responsibility, which goes back to being the conscience, but also making sure we have accountability within our organizations. So let me, we'll come back to you, but let me try to get John's comments here in this as well. And then we have a number of questions that have come in through the chat room already. So I'm gonna go through all those and give you all an opportunity to comment on those as well. John Rogers.
Well, thank you. I think it's important we have a call to action. I think it's so great that we can all be on message and be able to talk to political leaders and community leaders. They all have a sense of where we're coming from. I like the fact that there is a theme in here near the end of the call to action around purchasing. And working with minority-owned companies, I think, is really, really important. My suggestion would be that instead of calling it supplier diversity, which is typically called, it should be called business diversity. Because as you know, our economy has become more of a professional services and financial services and technology-based economy. And too much of the supplier diversity is focused on the old-fashioned supply chain, which is not really where the ecosystem is creating the most wealth today. So the University of Chicago is the place that coined this term business diversity, and I think it's much better than supplier diversity. And you keep track of the spending by category, so you know what's being spent. A second point I would just make, the last point is also, as we all know, we've all been in the boardroom when the deal comes. And you go to the law firms walk in, the PR firms walk in, the accounting firms walk in, and typically all the white male partners are there. I think we have a responsibility to challenge that and say if the company cares about diversity and inclusion, there should be diverse partners working on the relationships. As we're doing a deal or whatever the transaction happens to be, we have the power and influence to push those partners to have diversity on the teams that sort of support our companies. Exelon does a great job of that, and Bill Von Haney, who makes that program work, is my favorite. So those are two suggestions that I would think to maybe tighten up the call to action.
Thank you very much, John. We only have about 15 minutes late, so I'm gonna just run through these questions that have come up on chat. So starting from the beginning, and then we'll go around in reverse order. So oh man, there's a lot of activity here. Oh, we're 12 minutes behind. Will the session be recorded and available? The answer is yes, and it will be distributed next week. And then there's a lot of thank yous for all of you being on this panel and for being part of this. Somebody just says, this leader of comfort to a leader of consequence. Well said. A powerful concept. And somebody says we need to expose more leaders. We need to have more leaders, young and old alike, exposed to this concept. People agreeing with you, Matt, it's a demand issue. And then we have people telling me that we're really late. To Janet Wong, the question is, can you share any specifics about what you will be measuring and monitoring related to racial, ethnic issues in your company? Question for the panel from, this is from, God, I know that all these folks are asking questions. So Graciela has a question. ISS has sent letters to companies asking for voluntary disclosure of the race, ethnicity, composition of the board. To avoid defensiveness, should the focus be on the percentage of minorities, women at the board versus the percentages of whites, two sides of the same coin? You can view some more similar question on ISS. Matt's point about corporations disclosing board composition, prudential financial is a model. I have nothing to do with PF, but found info as part of the study we did at Latin Insights. Manny Fernandez says, what is the status of the House bill to disclose ethnicity? It passes the House, but is not going anywhere. Rochelle Campbell says, with regard to legislation, here's a great piece from the Chamber of Commerce. Sharas Solange says that BOFA released a report from the board last November about pay and ethnic equity. Question, can someone talk about prudential financial as a model? Question, can you share specifics about what will be measured and monitored? Comments on the importance of disclosure and measuring, that is really important to do. Bravo, John Rogers on business diversity, on professional service teams, and need to focus on not only on the pipeline for C-suite, but VP level and below. A thought to consider, Catalyst CEOs have a board-ready member they mentor and help get on a board. How about every F1000 CEO take an ethnic minority board-ready member and make it their goal? Oh my God. You know what, if I read all these things, there's lots of other questions. Let me add just how about including leading global board recruiting firms to support pipeline reporting? Actually, that was a comment that I had made in one of my emails earlier. What about advisory boards to create exposure and experience? Thoughts around it easier to influence PE, VC teams and driving diversity, etc. So those are some of the questions, and I know because of the shortness of time, I am going to ask you all to reflect on those questions, but to give what basically is a closing comment. We have about 10 minutes here, so why don't we go in the middle order? So instead of, we'll go with Evelyn first. Evelyn, respond to some of those comments and observations. Give us kind of a 2-minute call to action for us.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to go back to accountability because I think there was one important item that I think is really where it all comes together, and that's compensation. And I chair compensation, and that right now is a very difficult place to be for a number of reasons. But tying, whatever key metrics are developed as part of what your goals are and you're tracking within your organizations, tying it into compensation, but again, not just at the C-suite. This has to permeate throughout the entire organization. And I think it's really important for to be aware of the unknowing guards that can exist at certain companies that have a lot of influence over a person's career, over retention, over those types of things that really impact and can lead to some of these systemic issues. And it could be being done unknowingly. So I think it's really important to understand that throughout your organization, permeated all the way through. And then on the legislative side, and I heard something around legislative, just this morning, there was an announcement by California where they're looking at a bill very similar to what was passed several years ago with women. And the headlines were, in quotes, adding more color to corporate boards, new bill demands more diversity. So, I can wrap this up by saying that, and again, going back to the bill, it's more or less going to be the same type of bill that was passed for women in terms of what their expectations are. And they're defining the underrepresented group, which right now includes Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, Pacific Islander, Native American, Native Hawaiian, or Alaska Native. So that's, so now we're starting to see that, and that's pretty rapid. We don't know where it will go, but the fact that it's already in some state already being viewed. So what I would wrap it up by saying, what gets measured gets done. So I think it's really critical to look at your compensation metrics and think how this can be embodied in that, because what affects your compensation will get your attention. And accountability really is going to be critical to the success of this call to action.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Let's swing it over to Janet for her comments.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know there were a lot of questions and we don't have a lot of time, so those in the audience, you're welcome to send me a message via LinkedIn if your question didn't get answered. I know there was one about measurement, and I certainly think that starts in the boardroom and the executive levels of your company. And not just to look at, I know our call and focus is in the boardroom and more diversity, but also throughout the company, especially in your leadership pipeline, because your leadership pipeline are going to be future board directors, if not at the current company they're at other companies. And so as diverse groups, we need to think about how do we get more people that are ready to fill those board seats. And then I think sort of my parting words would be actions speak louder than words. You know, when all these issues came up centered around George Floyd, many companies, probably many of the ones that you're associated with, came out with their statements and their support of racial justice and racial inequities. And so I think now is the time that actions speak louder than words. And so we all need to get behind this call to action and make change.
Well said, Janet. Let's go to Matt, and then we'll bring it to John to bring us home.
I would highlight urgency and seizing this moment. We all know that boards, in more normal times at least, operate on a every other month or quarterly cadence. Board searches may happen only once or twice a year in the course of most boards' lives. And so there, I think, can be a risk of settling back into status quo. So I would really encourage that individuals on the call in their own boardrooms and in their own companies continue to capitalize on the momentum of this moment, on the focus in the broader culture, particularly on issues of racial and ethnic diversity, to really move their boards forward. I think the items in the call to action provide some very specific ways to do that.
So this is the time. John Rogers.
Well, thank you. I have two things. One, I was thinking, you know, we need to have in the call to action, have more unconscious bias training or implicit bias training, not only in the companies, but maybe even for our boards. Something I haven't thought deeply about, but we all know that there's still a lot of bias in our society and we have to guard against it. The second thing I was thinking is I've talked about and challenged us as minority directors to speak out and fight for economic and social justice in the boardroom. I also think we have to inspire our often white male CEOs to make it comfortable for us to have these uncomfortable conversations. You know, they have to welcome it. They have to make sure that all board members are welcoming it. And I think that's the job of the CEO, chairman of the board, lead director, to make people clear that if you're that first minority director, that second minority director, to understand that you should feel comfortable speaking out and getting these issues out onto the table. And these discussions are welcome by the entire board.
Well, that is awesome. Great comments and words, I think, that will live in our hearts and our minds and hopefully our actions moving into the future. I want to just close that up, since I think, Esther, correct me if I'm wrong, or Janet, I think I'm the last speaker to close it up. I have just a couple minutes. So I would say a few takeaways. One, the call to action was actually a lot of brain power went into that, but it's not final, right? So any of you get a copy of it. Let's get it to everybody on this call. You want to make changes to that, send them in so that they can be considered in the final call to action. The second takeaway from me is this California legislation has a lot of interest. And if you can get that circulated around everybody, question I would ask, should we actually, as women and minority members of boards, let's sign a letter, get something like that out to the Fortune 1000 or the Fortune 2000 or 3000, maybe do something that encourages other states to do it. But is there a legislative action there? Yeah, there's obviously the federal government has a significant role, but so do the states. Is there additional work there that we can do? And let me just finally close up by saying this. I think all of us in our own lives, certainly it's happened to me all the way from college, through law school, through my law career, through my service in the government as well as on boards. It's tough to be the first one, but it also gets to a point where if you push hard enough and you have a critical mass, then it starts happening. I mean, for us, part of the reason Target is a prime sponsor of this event today is because Leigh Shaward and people like Monica Lozano and Kel Darden and other people who are on that board really strongly believe in diversity, as is our CEO. So we have a very diverse board. We look at our succession planning all the way down to layers way under. We see a problem. I saw a problem last year, for example, with the African-American community, not enough people on that succession pipeline. We created a program to do that. So my own statement to all of you and all of us, we need to do what we can internally within our own companies where we have a significant power as board members. But secondly, what we need to do is also look at externally to, I think it was Matt's point, making sure that we engage other stakeholders to achieve the same end. Because if we don't have diversity in corporate America at the leadership level, we're missing out on a whole bunch of things that are all part of one of the major issues that we're facing today in this nation, and that's how we get to racial and gender equality. I'll conclude by saying this. When President Obama and I were talking about my becoming Secretary of Interior, I love being a United States Senator, worked with many of you as a United States Senator, but I decided to do it. And part of the reason is Senator Danny Anyway from Hawaii said to me, Ken, it's the most important cabinet position in all of government because you're in charge of all of America's natural resources. But he said, you're in charge of America's heritage. And so I said, okay, I will do that and I'll be the custodian. So what we did is, I remember walking down the National Mall with Danny Anyway and some other folks, and there was not a single representation of African-American, Native American women, Latino contributions on the front yard of the nation's capital. And so what we did is we undertook an effort, which is probably one step in a mile that we got to walk. But we now have a Martin Luther King National Memorial on the National Mall. We have an African-American museum. We have a Native American museum. Administratively, because it wasn't on the mall, we brought in the Beaumont House, which was a place where the suffrage movement for women started now 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago. But that's what led to the creation of the right to vote 100 years ago in 1920. And so we started lifting that up. There's a lot more work that has to be done, but obviously it has to be done in the corporate boardrooms and in corporate leadership. So I appreciate all of you doing this. Esther, to you and all the organizations that brought this together. Carmen, for keeping us on track over the last many months as this plan was organized. And I would say the call to action is, let's get to work, more work to do on the call to action. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon, and have a wonderful and safe day. And let's be optimistic, because our best days as a humanity, as a nation, are still ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We are going to capture the notes that you sent in the chat room and update the call to action. We also want to organize another conversation where we can break up into the chat rooms and still have this discussion. So the road is only just begun, and really appreciate everyone's participation. It's made a big difference, and it's about action and accountability, and we seek to monitor these items. Thank you very much.